Welcome back. This is Module 2 of AI Risk Assessment for Non-Technical Leaders. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If you complete Module 1, you already understand something most people in your field may not. You understand that AI governance fails because of human behavior, not technology. Now we are going to build the methodology to fix it. This module is called Structure Risk Assessment without technical expertise. And I mean that literally. You do not need to understand how an AI system works to assess whether it is causing harm. I'm going to show you how. We have 6 lessons today. Each one builds on the last one. By the time we reach lesson 6, you will conduct your first real AI risk scan, not a hypothetical, an actual scan on a real system in your organization. From a governance perspective, the issue is not merely operational inefficiency, it is the absence of defensible decision-making frameworks that are capable of withstanding regulatory, legal, and public scrutiny. Our objective is established through a scalable model that integrates not only behavior analytical compliance oversight, but also system accountability into one unified operational structure. Before we get into the content, let me tell you exactly what you're walking away with today. By the end of this module, you will be able to define risk assessments precisely and be able to explain why most organizations are doing risk awareness instead. You will apply a clinical framework called Biopsychosocial Model to evaluate the AI systems without really touching the code. You will identify the 5 most common AI failure patterns before they become incidents. You will know which validate instruments align with international regulatory standards. You will document AI risks in a format that can survive regulatory reviews. And I'm hoping that you will complete your first organizational AI risk scans using a 5-step replicable protocol. Every one of those outcomes is accessible to you regardless of, I guess, technical background. And this is not a simplification that is on point. So just take a review here. I'm just going to give you a moment to pause, and therefore you're able to be able to discuss it. Okay, so let's go to slide 3. I want you to look at the slide for a moment and take a brief moment. I'll give you a few seconds. On August 2nd, 2026, yes, this year, this is not just a general guideline, that is a legal deadline that is provided under the European Union's AI Act, which applies not just to European organizations, but to any organizations whose AI system can affect people in the European sector. Conformity assessments, technical documentation, and risk management system must be completed for all high-risk AI systems by that date. If your organization uses AI to screen job applicants, to approve or deny credit, or to make decisions in education or healthcare, assist in law enforcement, that system is likely classified as high risk, and the deadline is very real. So, for example, what high risk really means in practice. A Canadian company uses an AI tool, for example, to rank incoming resumes before a human recruiter even reviews them. That system operates in the employment domain. You might have heard about the ATS, Applicant Testing System. Under the EU AI Act Annex the 3rd, it qualifies as a high-risk AI system, even if the company's servers are in Toronto, excuse me. So the second number you see on your screen this is the one we're talking about. The second number is 492 million. That is what global market is expected to spend on AI data governance in 2026 alone, according to Gartner, and it is projected to exceed about $1 billion by 2030. So the market has already priced in the urgency. The question is whether your organization has as well. And the third number is 7%. This is what you're looking at here. What that means is that the maximum fine for a serious European Union AI Act violation, not 7% of its EU revenue, 7% of global annual revenue for a company generating $500 million a year. That is $35 million for a company at $1 billion. It is $70 million. So I'm not here to frighten you. I'm here to make the urgency concrete, because that is what gets governance taken seriously at that leadership level, and not abstract ethical principles by numbers that appear in board presentations. We're talking about structured risk assessment is no longer a best practice, it is a legal requirement, and that is where we begin. And remember, effective leadership requires the ability to distinguish between symptomatic issues and structural deficiencies. So therefore, the implementation strategies that we may implement must account for operational sustainability, workforce adaptation, stakeholder impact, and the regulatory alignment simultaneously. Slide 4. Lesson 2, I want you to look at what risk assessment actually means. There is a lot of questions on this slide, and I want you to think about it before you answer it. I had private emails being sent out, and most people inquire about accountability. Some people inquire about deployment, deliberation, differentiation in the system, of course, discrimination and due diligence. These are all important content, absolutely. What is the difference between knowing your organization has AI risks and being able to prove it to a regulator, a board, or a court, or as we call it, a governing body? Most organizations know they have AI risks. I mean, everybody should know AI may have risk or potential risk. Very few can prove it, but the gap between knowing and proving is what structured risk assessment closes. And if you need a few minutes to think about that, again, if you watched a previous module, I am really big on you putting your discussions out there, asking questions, because these questions also challenge my analytical perspective and allows me to further enhance my knowledge in this area, especially when you're hearing it from somebody else as well. So therefore, I like you to think about these factors as we are talking and learning together as a team. The difference directly on the left side of this slide, I have listed 5 things that feel like risk management but provide no legal or regulatory protection. A general sense that AI might cause problems, a discussion in terms of team meetings, an informal list from IT, a vendor's self-assessment, a policy document that acknowledges risks exist. These are all forms of risk awareness. They are better than nothing. But if a regulator audits your organization, or a class action lawsuit lands on your desk, or a board member asks you to prove your AI governance is adequate, none of those 5 things will protect you. So let me give you an example of risk awareness in practice. A hospital administrator says in a leadership meeting, we all know our AI triage tool has some biases issues we need to address. First warning, we all know our triage tool has some bias issues we need to address. The term we need to address speaks for itself, because if you took module 1, you understand that a lot of compliance and governance in risk assessment, you are assigned to a specific task when you're working with AI. That statement is documented in a meeting minutes. It's never followed by a formal assessment. 18 months later, the hospital faces a discrimination complaint that the meeting minutes are now evidence that leadership knew and did nothing structured to address it. You know that theory, when it snowballs down the hill, the snowball just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the question is who's going to take accountability and who's going to be responsible. Now look at the right side. A documented process for identifying specific risk categories is structured analysis using validated instruments. Named accountability Who assesses what, when, and how? Independent verification, meaning sometimes a third-party verification. A record that can be reviewed, audited, and updated over time. You have to be aware that AI is continuously being developed and it's going to be very dynamic, it's going to be changing constantly. Therefore, you need to be adaptable in order to keep up with the changes. Now, what does this actually mean? Let's break it down. These 5 elements together constitute a structured risk assessment. Every one of them can be implemented without technical expertise. None of them require you to understand the machine learning or neural network. They require documentation, discipline, and defined process. That is all. So here's an example for you to make sense of what I'm saying. Structured assessment in practice. The same hospital administrator, upon hearing that there's concerns in the meeting, initiates a formal risk assessment. A named risk officer applies the Biopsychosocial framework. So in this case, we're going to say Tiana Mash is responsible, which we will cover in a moment, discussing the documents and the specific failure models. The findings are rated by severity. A remediation timeline is assigned, and the assessment is reviewed quarterly when the discrimination complaint arrives. The hospital can then demonstrate it identified the concerns and investigated structurally and took documentation action. This is defensible position. Now, the difference is not sophistication, it is simply a structure. A structure that is something every organization can easily develop with proper talent, and they don't need expensive consultants like me or my team. Now that we know what structured risk assessment is, let me give you the process. The 4-stage framework comes from a 2025 study published through MIT At-Risk Repository, one of the most comprehensive peer-reviewed collections of AI governance research in the world at the moment. At least this is in my opinion. The stages are framing, assessment, evaluation, guideline, elaboration, and each one has a question that drives it or moves it. Stage 1 is framing the question. The question is, what are we assessing and why does it matter? Before you assess anything, you define the scope of which AI system, which use case, which population of people is affected. This step exists because organizations often begin risk assessments without knowing that they are actually assessing the affected population. These steps are important without knowing, because without knowing, you can't actually address these matters. So to make this a little bit more clear, let's talk about framing. And here's an example of what I mean by framing. Before assessing any organization, in this case, we're going to talk about your organization's AI hiring tool. Framing means answering. We are assessing the resume screening model used in our recruitment process for all positions at or below manager level, affecting applicants in Ontario specifically, because this is where I am. The specificity is what makes the assessment useful. In stage 2, the assessment, the question is what can go wrong for whom and under what condition, right? What are we discussing right here? Think about it for a second. This is where you do the actual identification work. You will build the tools for this lesson in 2.2 and 2.3. Stage 3, the question is how serious is each risk? This is where you're evaluating, right? Who bears the consequences? Who's going to be the one responsible if something goes wrong? Who's going to be responsible if, a governing body, fines the company? Who's going to be responsible if, as a result of the outcome or the output, someone was seriously harmed, whether psychological, physical, emotional? Now, you might think, what do you mean? Not all risks are equal. You're right. A risk that causes minor inconvenience to a large group is different from a risk that causes serious harm to a vulnerable individual. Evaluation is required to relate to the severity, likelihood, and reversibility, and to think carefully about who is most exposed. And you might think, are you serious? Are you kidding? Yes, I'm kidding. I always say common knowledge is not so common, and common sense is not very common amongst people either. Take it as leave it. Sometimes truth hurts, right? Guidance elaboration. This question is, what must change? Who is responsible? Who's accountable? Who does the reviews? Who does the sign up? This is the stage that most organizations skip. They complete the first 3 stages informally. They usually say it's a draft form of general impressions that the risk is acceptable or manageable, and they can produce no document output. No documentation means no governance. No governance means no protection. No protection means irresponsibility, and of course, you're going to face the consequences of those actions. This stage produces the deliverables, named accountability, specific recommendation, review dates, accountable persons, everything that gives the assessment its teeth. These 4 stages are the backbone of everything else in this module. When you complete your Practicum in lesson 2.6, you will follow all 4. Now, let me make this very clear. I will be providing you the power presentation, and at a later time, I will be providing some other assessment tools that you can utilize. And of course, this would be based on your background and knowledge pertaining to not only executive functioning, human behavior, or maybe judicial background. Overall is understanding the context of how AI works and in what capacity. Before we move on, I want you to sit with 2 questions. You can pause this video and read the questions out loud. You can review it, you can question it, and be able to decipher if it's something that you want to discuss in a discussion, maybe even provide an impact assessment or incident response where you can incorporate this infrastructure with liability and life cycle management for me to even follow through. I love to read these discussion posts. And of course, I did mention at the beginning of this video, you can add me on LinkedIn. If you need my assistance, I would be more than happy to provide that assistance. Now, think about the last time your organization discussed AI risk. What is the structure? Was anyone named as accountable? Was it documented to a standard that would hold up externally with governing bodies or opposing governing bodies? Was it conversation that ended without a record? Remember, every record, especially digital record, becomes protection and evidence-based for you, especially when you're dealing with human populations, especially when you're dealing with projects that could really inadvertently risk someone's health, well-being, and overall life cycle. And question number 2, drop your answers again in the comments and read what others are saying, because the patterns you will see in those comments reflects the state of AI governance across industries right now. And that is a valuable information for a lot of us, including myself. Lesson 2.2, the biopsychosocial model applied to AI. As you know, I have a background in psychology with focus on forensics. I know what you might be thinking, what is clinical framework from medicine doing an AI governance course. Here is the most basic answer. The biopsychosocial model was developed by a physician by the name of George Engel in 1977. He argued that to truly understand or comprehend a patient's condition, you could not only add the biology, the physical symptoms, basically, the lab results, which is the scans, and you also had to look at the psychological dimensions, how the patient was thinking, behaving, responding, and the social dimensions, their relationship, their environment, their community circumstances. And in 2026, we also talk about the cultural competence, the cultural traditional values, religious beliefs, spiritual practices. These key questions on the slide is the one I want you to carry through this entire lesson. If a clinician can assess a person's risk without understanding their neurology, why can't leaders assess an AI system's risk without understanding its code? The answer is they can. And this lesson will show you that. The biopsychosocial model adapts for AI risk assessment, which gives us 3 dimensions to evaluate and a set of specific questions for each one. The dimension B, which is the biological aspect of it, in AI governance, this maps to the technical architecture of the system, what data does, what data it uses, what it uses the data for, what the output does or produces, what happens when the inputs are wrong or incomplete, has the system been tested in conditions outside of its training environment. Now here's the important point. You do not need to understand the model architecture to answer these questions. You need access to the vendor's documentation, the system's data dictionary, and the incident log. You're asking what goes in and what comes out, not how the algorithm works. So here's an example of a B dimension. A municipality uses an AI system to prioritize their maintenance requests across the city of Toronto. The B dimension assessment asks what data that this system uses, right? Where is this data coming from? Who collected the data? Do we have conformity? Do we have consent to use the data? The answer is really simple. Address, request type, and report urgency, right? If you have the address, your request type, and the reported urgency, the next question would be, what happens when the inputs are incomplete? What do you think? I would think the answer would be unknown. There's no documentation on how the system handles missing fields. That is a finding. You have just identified a failure point without touching the code. Governance is all about framework and harm mitigation. And most of these incidents are human oversight and lack of due diligence. Dimension P, which is the psychological perspective. The psychological perspective, this is human interaction dimension. Do users trust the AI outputs more than they should? Are AI decisions reviewed by humans before action is taken? What happens when the AI and a human expert disagrees? Right? How does automation bias, the tendency to overtrust automated outputs, will be assessed in a specific user population? And I want you to think about this. I recently got a paper from a student to review, and part of the reference was Jennifer Lopez. I can't remember what it was, but I love reading papers because they say when you read other people's work, you really get an understanding in corroboration and contingency. And of course, by reading these papers, you be able to provide an explainability of infrastructure, especially when you're dealing with students writing about integrity and human infrastructure as it pertains to AI. So what does that really essentially means, right? Because most students will be like, okay, well, I have my paper, I uploaded the assignment and I'm going to have AI generate the response. Well, AI will generate a response. As you know, hallucinations are very real. And especially when you're working with a specific AI product, one of the things you will learn is their pattern of style of writing. People say it's very robotic, but if you learn the prompts and if you learn the proper way of using AI as a resource tool, you'd be surprised about the final outcome. But again, you have to do the work, right? It's very different when I was going to university and I had to go through 70, 80 scholarly reviews when I was working on my dissertation. Now you could upload one of these journals and within seconds you have the summary, you have the population, you have the discussion, you have the method. Like, it's amazing, right? And then you're able to actually compose a proper paper by using proper identification as a result of reading 18 to 20 pages. Now, if you're not a reader, which seems like most of my students are not, it's an easy tool. If you're someone who suffers from ADHD, if you're someone who, maybe English is not your first language, the possibility of different translations in different language. This is where Module 1 and Module 2 will connect directly. is through this psychological human interaction, because the cognitive biases we discussed in module 1, automation biases, authority bias, are the exact risk variables you're assessing right now in the P dimension. So if you haven't watched module 1, I strongly suggest for you to go and watch it, because things will start to make a bit sense to you if they don't. Now, how do we explain the P dimension? So let's, for example, talk about a financial institution's loan officers using AI credit scoring system, which is happening in almost every bank. The P dimension assessment asks what happens when the AI scores and the loan officer's judgment conflict, right? One of the main reasons AI is being so useful is because of the overuse of fake documentation, the overuse of fraud in, for example, obtaining mortgages or loans. So after interviewing 3 loan officers, let's say you're working as, this specialist, and you realize, you find that all 3 have deferred to an AI score in every case of a conflict in the past year, even when they had concerns. That is what automation bias has confirmed as an active risk assessment. So if the AI scores and the loan officer's judgment conflict, you have to wonder why. What deferred? And most people do defer to AI scores in a lot of case conflict in the assessments, right? And people are asking more and more because most banks will provide you an explanation. That is mandatory. Again, you cannot have an oversight. Fairness, compliance is important. And of course, I'm not really familiar with the financial market in a banking perspective, but I guess there might be benchmarking, and to be able to work with your due diligence, you need to have these required information. And the last question is the social, organization, and community impact. This is far more superior right now in our organization, being so diverse, so many different languages, and especially like in Canada, but specifically in Ontario. The social dimension is the community and organizational impact. Huge application. Which populations are most affected by this AI's decision? Are impacts distributed equitably across demographic groups? What community trust or institutional legitimacy is at stake? And are we questioning the fundamental rights impact assessment being conducted, especially when we're talking about human rights issues, right? Or in the American culture, the constitutional rights. So the last question, I want you to think about the fundamental rights impact assessment, which is short form for FRIA, F-R-I-A, just the first initials, is a legal requirement under the European Union AI Act for high-risk AI deployments. And it's operated entirely in the social dimension, and it is one of the most commonly missing elements in most organizations when working with AI governance today, which is really odd, considering that in present day, we take freedom of information, human rights, as more serious than we ever have. And here in Ontario, we look at things completely in a different context when it comes to cultural competency. Huge. Like sometimes when I think about it, I am just blown away that discrimination can actually be overlooked in these AI products. And people are like, no, AI doesn't make a mistake. Really? I will be posting other courses that discusses discrimination and biases in AI, and it's pretty entertaining for some, but pretty educational for others. Now, to make you understand or imagine the dimension of S, I'd like you to think about a school board uses an AI system, for example, to identify students at risk for dropping out. The S dimension assessment usually asks or inquires about the impact distributed equitably. Are we looking at this at a cross board? Are we looking at not just one demographic location, one particular race, one particular culture, one particular area? Reviewing outcome data shows that systems flag students from lower income postal codes at significantly higher rates than students with equivalent academic profiles from higher income areas. That is a social dimension finding. And it is something that a principal, a superintendent, or school board trustee can identify without a data science background, right? I mean, you see it. The 3 dimensions, 12 questions total, 4 per dimension, no technical expertise required, just structured and observation and documented answers for you, right? So review it if you have to screenshot it, if you want to save it. Very important slide. These are cool. I like to look at these 2 questions before we move on. Question 1 is pick one AI system your organization currently uses and apply the 3 dimensions. What do you know about it? What do you know about its technical outputs? How do users interact with it? And who does it affect in the community? What gaps can you identify? If you're able to do this on your own, notice I said gaps, not answers, gaps. It is completely normal to find that you cannot answer several of these questions. That inability in itself is a finding. It's self-righteousness, self-identification, self-knowledge. It tells you what information your organization is currently lacking. Question 2 asks you which of the 3 dimensions, technical, psychological, or social, is most consistently absent from AI risk assessment in your sector. If you work in the public service sector, my guess is it's the psychological dimension. If you work in the financial services, it is probably the social. Drop your answers in the comment and let's see if I'm right, just by curiosity. Lesson 2.3, identifying high probability failure points. I don't know why my slide looks so convoluted. My apologies. The MIT AI Risk Repository, which synthesizes 95% peer review studies and has a catalog, I believe, over, I think, 1,700 codes of AI risk. Look, it's on the slide. Consistently identifies 5 failure categories at the highest probability in organizational AI deployments. So I'm going to walk you through each one, and for each one I'm going to give you an observable signal, something you can look for right now without a technical audit. Failure category 1. The data governance failure. This is an AI trained on biased, incomplete, or outdated data producing systemically flawed outputs. It is the most common failure type in hiring, credit, and healthcare AI system. The observable sign would be the outputs that correlate with protected characteristics, race, gender, age, postal code, in ways that cannot be explained by legitimate job-related or credit-related factors. So a vendor data documentation that is absent or generic, if you ask a vendor that provides you this AI system for your HR system, where their training data came from, and the answer is vague, that is a signal. Just because someone offers you an AI product and tries to sell you on it because their reports, their findings, their backers are all for it, it doesn't mean it's reputable. It doesn't mean it's credible. It doesn't mean it can be validated. Make sure you are looking into third-party assessments. You know what? I'd rather spend the money up front assessing these products instead of getting a lawsuit, and of course with the lawsuit, a bad reputation. Human oversight and gaps. The failure category number 2, AI decisions being implemented without meaningful human reviews. Automation biases usually are caused by reviewers to approve AI outputs rather than evaluate them. What I mean is, if you think about the observable signal, no documented escalation path when AI and human judgments are conflicted. No one is documenting. So when there's no records of it, there's an overrides. If no one in your organization can tell you the last time a human overrode an AI decision and why, that is a signal. That means it's not being documented. That means it's not being followed. That means that you are in the process of failing an audit and, of course, facing the consequences of that audit. Failure category number 3, the scope drift. An AI system that originally deployed for one purpose gradually extended to others without really reevaluating, reassessing. Why? Because no AI system is fit for one system. You are continuously updating, upgrading, reassessing, reevaluating, retesting, input, outputs, and then you have to, replicate and then be sure that the results are consistently, properly being outputted, not just hallucinated. Observable signals like AI performing functions that are not described in the original procurement documents. What does that mean? Are we looking at systemic risks, systemic biases, sustainability, transparency, traceability? These are important, especially for workflow governance. Remember, no records of overrides. If no one in your organization can tell you the last time a human AI was overridden, then you need to understand the override gaps. Huge, huge, huge thing. Right? Why is it important? Example, a retail chain deploys an AI system to optimize inventory management. 2 years later, a manager uses the system, the same system, data patterns to make a scheduling decision about which employees work high traffic shifts. That system was never assessed for that use. So that is the scope of drift, and it creates liability, and organizations do not understand that it's happening or know that it's happening. And this is why it's imperative that, those of you that are taking this course to advance yourself fundamentally in regards to AI governance, you're looking at it in a complete different perspective. The fourth one, accountability vacuum. No named person is responsible for monitoring ongoing AI performance. What does that mean? Responsibility diffuses across teams, meaning no one is actually responsible, right? When you ask someone who monitors an AI system and no one can tell you a single name, or when the last test was done, when the last evaluation was done, when was the last the policy was updated, where is the documentation of conflict, test, this is in your organization tomorrow. I'll bet you any money you'll find issues with it. Ask 3 different colleagues who's responsible for monitoring your most significant AI systems. Even if you're a leader, just because you pay somebody to do the work for you, you still need to be responsible. If you get 3 different answers or no answers, you have accountability vacuum. Accountability means lawsuits. Accountability means possible criminal or bylaw charges, potential harms to clients. You're working with humans, you need to be well aware of the high potential probability. Transparency deficits. Stakeholders affected by AI decisions cannot understand or consent to them. People receiving AI-driven decisions report having no explanation or no appeal mechanism. This is both ethical failure, and under the European United AI Act, it's a legal one. I think if you look up the Act under Article 13 and 14, it requires that high-risk AI systems provide specific due diligence and meaningful transparency to affected individuals. You have to provide an explanation. And when someone says, no, I don't, yeah, you do. You do. And you know what? It could be a civil matter. It could be, another governing efficiency matter. It could be, for us, it could be ministry related, so they can come and audit your organization. These 5 categories, 5 signals, none of them require technical background to observe. They require access, attention, and willingness to document what you find. And when you watch lesson 1, you understand about conformity and why it's important. Groupthink mentality, fear of retribution, fear of being ostracized by your peers. These are all important perspectives, and I do not disagree with anyone, especially under supervisory authority. I understand this is a standardization, and sometimes you have to safeguard yourself. But remember, risk exposure is a lot worse, right? Especially if the potential for risk of harm is higher. So look at these 2 questions here, and again, if you could answer them, it would be really amazing. The second question is particularly important in my experience. The failure categories most commonly are dismissed without investigations, and this is ones that later produce the largest liability. So you could drop down your ideas and give me some ideas to better advance myself, because I'm always trying to learn when questions come up and I don't necessarily have the answer, I actually will do the research for you and send you the answers when necessary. Validation instrument and structural observation. The structured observation is, especially for those of us that are in research and look at the world in a complete different mindset, theoretical lanes, and framework. We now have a framework for what to assess. The question is what tools to use to assess it. I'm going to walk you through 4 caliber to different levels of organizational readiness. Tool 1 is the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. This is a voluntary framework published by the United States National Institute of Standard and Technology. It was expanded significantly through 2024 and 2025. It is one of the most widely adopted AI governance framework in this world, and I am a huge fan of it as well. It has 4 functions: govern, map, measures, and manage. And you do not need a technical background to use it. You need to understand the discipline to answer its questions systemically and document your answers accordingly. So, for example, how would you use NIST AI RMF is through insurance company applies them usually. Map functions of NIST AI, usually they're claims processing AIs. And the map function asks them to identify the context and category risk. So walking through the map questions, they discovered that AI systems have never been assigned or assessed for how it performs on specific claims that are submitted by policyholders, especially in rural areas. So where response time and claim types differ significantly, what we find the urban population on which the system was trained, the gap would not have been visible without a structured instrument. And this is why NIST AI risk management framework is so important when you're conducting evaluation or assessment to identifying gaps. Tool 2 is the ISO, and I only remember ISO IEC 4201 because of my phone, literally. And why is this important? This is the first international standard for AI management system. If your organization is pursuing certification, this is the framework. It's Clause 6.1 mandates to document risk assessment, but importantly, it leaves the methodology to organizational discretion. This is where the course comes in. The biopsychosocial framework and the 4-stage process from lesson 2.1 are both compatible methodologies for satisfying clause 6.1. So tool 3 is about structured observation protocol. This is non-technical audit tool adapted from forensical behavior observational methodology. It is exactly what it sounds like, a systemic process for documenting what an AI system does under observation. Without accessing the model, you can observe inputs and outputs discrepancies between expected and actual outputs and human responses to those outputs. So if they're overdefined over time period, you date every entry, you sign every section, and you produce a record that is contemporaneous or documented or defensible. So what does that really mean? A social service organization uses an AI tool to, for example, generate recommendations for clients. For 30 days, a designated observer documents every instances where a caseworker's independent judgment differs from an AI recommendation. Along with these reasons, the caseworkers record, for example, for the difference and the ultimate outcome. At the end of 30 days, the observation record shows that AI recommendations for clients in a specific demographic groups are being consistently overwritten, and the outcome in those cases are measurably better. This is both governance finding and evidence-based for recommendation, right? So what you're doing, you're showing a clean, consistent pattern of why this is important. And if you think, well, why would it be important? Why wouldn't it be important? Think about it. When you can provide an explanation, why? Why is it important? And most people will look at it and be like, well, why wouldn't it be important? The scenario constitutes the governance finding because it's relevant measurable discrepancies between the system output and real world professional judgment under what we operationally condition. So I think the social services is no longer relying on an assumption about fairness and effectiveness. It is now possessing the empirical evidence to demonstrate that the system behaves differently across demographic conditions, and that humans' intervention materially improves the outcome. Right? We're talking about fairness and non-discrimination, human oversight validation, evidence-based governance, right? Override frequency, demographic distinction, rational documentation, and comparative outcomes. And by doing this, we look at the outcome-based risk detection. This is a critical issue, not simply that overrides what it occurs, but it is the overwritten cases produce better outcomes. Right? Now we have measurable performance inefficiency, potential systemic harm, operational inequality. So without outcome tracking, the organization could not determine whether overrides represents unnecessary work deviation or legitimate correction of model failure. And I can go on for hours about this, and this is why it is so imperative that we are talking about structural observations and how it's used. Tool number 4. This is the European Union AI Act Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment, and I use this a lot. This is a legally mandated assessment for high-risk AI deployment affecting specifically the European Union residents, but the documentation is full of data. It's so vital when you're working, especially with your own organization, or if you're getting into consulting with AI governance. What does it do? Why is it important? Again, you have to look at who your customers are. You have to look at who your subjects are. At least certain AI systems are capable of materially affecting the fundamental rights of civil liberties, social participation at population scale. So this exists not to only ensure that organizations evaluate those impacts before and during a deployment, rather after the harm has also occurred. So the legal rationale is grounded in the severe principles. High-risk AIs can affect fundamental rights. How? Employment, education, healthcare, policing, migration, social services, credit assessment, and public administration. So the systems can influence and access to housing, employment, healthcare benefits, or legal protection, but a flawed AI system's decision-making therefore interferes with the rights protected under the Charters of Fundamental Rights. And this is also looking at the European Union as well. Human dignity, equality, privacy, non-discrimination, freedom of expression, and so on. So this is actually available for you to download if you choose to do so. Feel free to download it online directly on their website. I have a hard copy, and of course I also have everything on my drives, my external hard drives when I'm working independently. So it's really good to have, and I strongly recommend that. Now the 2 questions I want you to focus on for this particular slide is understand that no organization has been assigned to answer the second question, right? I'm just putting it out there because, again, I enjoyed reading your comments. Now, accountability vacuum, and I think is the most urgent one that you have the right now, but name it, own it, that is a governance, and that is what you need to focus on when we are working with the human population, especially with FRIA forces organizations to assess the risk systemically. Technical compliance alone is not sufficient. I think an AI system may be technically accurate yet still socially harmful. For example, we talked about predictive policing model in another course if you have been following me. I also discussed it in module 1 about disproportionately targeting specific minority communities. We look at employment screening systems may inadvertently disadvantage disabled applicants. We look at welfare eligibility models may produce exclusionary outcome despite statistic validity. So these are factors that you need to work on advancing yourself to fully understand why they are important. So let's talk about documenting risk at forensic standard. Now, up to this point, I hope you're holding on. I know this is a long session and some people might get bored, but to really get to the context and understand how one is responsible, it's important for me to be very clear and concise. So here we go. Most organizations produce risk documentation that would not survive external reviews. And I'm not saying this to be critical. I'm not saying this to be, disrespectful. I'm saying this because I've seen it. Providing a documentation or a policy that says draft over it to protect you. Well, we don't have a policy in place, but we have a draft version. So your employees are working without a policy in place, and there is no rules and regulations as to how to use a particular AI system. They might be using an AI system that has not been approved, and information can be leaking, confidential information can be exposed. But not only that, you are at high risk of being affected by a lot of other factors within the system. So what I like you to focus on is understanding the importance of why we are all about understanding documentation. And when I used to work for the government early years of my career, one of the things that we understood was how important it was to document everything, especially when you're working with human lives. And in my case, I was working with clients that were in the judicial system that were facing serious charges, not even summary, but indictable offenses. So for me, documentation would protect not only you, but those that you work with, the organization itself. And of course, as you know, reputation is very important, and how you choose to represent yourself, not only when you work for the organization, especially when you are called to task or you're called to court, you need to explain all of this. And a forensic standard AI risk document contains these 7 elements that we're going to talk about. And I always say this because I find research shows that most organizations do not have a proper risk documentation. And of course, this is something that can be fixed even starting today. And individuals that are able to speak up for themselves and be able to really call out situational factors that can protect the employer, and not only the employer, protect yourself. What you're going to see is on your number 1 element is the name assessor. This is huge for me. Name assessors, the specific names and role of the person who is conducting what section of the assessment. So if you're using a chatbot for your company, who's responsible for it, right? Not the compliance team. I'm not talking about the IT compliance team, not the leadership, your managers, front managers, back managers, the person who actually sits there and responds to these concerns. Because when something goes wrong, regulators and courts want to know who was responsible. A vague attribution to protect one is not going to protect you, right? Element 2, it's defining the scope. Which AI system, which use cases, which affected population, which time period stated explicitly. You need to identify it, who, what, when, where, down to what weather it was, what you observed, what you heard, what you did, how you assisted. Do not assume. Do not put your assumption. It is, I think, I believe. None of those matters, what you think or what you believe. Is it appeared as, it demonstrated such as, it made a statement such as, or like, such. You always use it in a matter where you are not putting your emotion or your preference or your interpretation into this documentation. Element number 3 is the methodology statement. Which instrument or framework are you using if you are the person in charge? So identify it. Are you using, which framework are you using? Are you using biopsychosocial framework, structured observational protocol? Are you using any form of inventory that, AI system that addresses AI systems, and why you select them for that specific context? Explain why you chose that, that specific inventory tool for you to do these audits if necessary, to conduct these risk assessments. And you have to provide these explanations, because these explanations are required, God forbid, if you ever have to face, the tribunal, or if you have to, face a governing body that manages or audits your organizations such as yours. Element 4 is evidence-based. This is AI governance that we are talking about. Now, evidence-based is very simple. We hear this this statement all the time, mostly in law enforcement shows, and we've seen the compassion that some humans have with crime and justice. So we hear the term evidence-based quite often. What information was reviewed, where and what your sources were, who did you consult, what data was examined, where did the data come from, what population was the data representing, was it demographically fair, what were the dates and access records. This is equivalent in a forensic chain of custody. It established that your findings are grounded in actual evidence and not impression. And these documentations can be verifiable information for you to use to support decisions, justify control, demonstrate compliance and validity in the system performance. Additionally, I think it transformed governance from assumption to demonstrate accountability, which is huge when you're dealing with AI governance. Now, some of the evidence-based that I would like you to consider specifically is audit logs. I have risk assessments, I have override records, model testing results. And where did you get these model testing results? Bias evaluation reports, incident reports, human review notes, validation studies, finding the benchmark data specifically for the program or the AI that you're using, monitoring dashboards, vendor disclosure, data lineage, policy approvals, who approved them, who's the person that is passing these authority of approvals, governance committee decisions, corrective action records if you have any, red teaming outcomes, and statistical disparity and analysis. I do go over what AI is in one of my courses. I haven't recorded that, but I will be doing that where I explain the linguistic behind the use of AI. You can also actually take a course, I think it's called Claude 101 or AI Fundamentals if you have access to Coursera, or if you have access to LinkedIn Learn, you can possibly complete those courses. They're not long, they're about 2 hours, but it's so worth it. So with that, we are going to go into the technical perspective of AI governance and documentation while we're on here. The governance documentation usually looks at the framework, the policies, the matrices, the escalation procedures, the oversight committee records, and then the technical documentation are model cards. We look at systemic architectural diagrams, training methodologies, hyperparameter records, evaluation metrics, and data set descriptions, which is used for me. And for risk documentations, I use risk registers, bias assessments, threat models, impact assessments, FRIA reports, and I also look at operational documentation, so deployment records, monitoring procedures, incident response logs, override documentations, and I want to know who overrided them and why. Human review protocols, very important to me if they use FRIA reports. And then for compliance, I always advise the client about regulatory mapping, about vendor contracts. I like to see where the vendor gets their data from. How did the vendor test the product in liability, credibility, and validity? I look at the DPIAs, the consent records, audit reports, and conformity assessments. The relationship between evidence-based and documentation is as important for me as between two people getting married. AI documentation creates the structure, and I think the evidence-based provides the proof. So therefore, this is why evidence-based is so vital when we are working with specific findings. And element 5 is about severity rating. And I think severity rating really speaks for itself. And when you're talking about the severity of a situation or crisis, you're rating it. And how are you rating it? Each risk identifies or categorized or classified by the likelihood of potential harm or risk, with the evidence supporting each classification. This is the equivalent of a forensic chain of custody. It establishes that your findings are grounded, again, not only in actual evidence, and but it's not based on your impression. Additionally, this is not just list of concerns, it is a structured analysis with a defensible rating for each item. So what this means is that the governance requires prioritization, proportionately, and defensible decision making. A severity rating converts raw observations into operational risk intelligence that then organizations can act upon and justify an audit. So without the severity classification, every issue appears equally important, and governance systems therefore use structured risk ratings to distinguish that. So critical risk for minor deficiencies, systemic harm from isolation anomalies, immediate threat from long-term concerns. And then we also look at governance requires risk prioritization. So what does that mean? Organizations operate with resources, personnel, remediation capacities, regulatory timelines, and then we look at the ratings that help determine the severity, which risk requires immediate escalation, which risk can be monitored, which risk requires mitigation plan, and which may be operatively acceptable. Yes, this is a lot of information, but I'd rather you know it than not know it. And then we're going to be talking about element 6. This is dissenting the analysis. This is any concern that is raised during the assessment that were not incorporated into the final findings, documented, or not discarded properly. This is the element that is almost universally absent from organizational risk documentation, and it is the one the most often becomes legally significant after a failure occurs. So if someone raised a concern during an assessment process and it was not acted on, that needs to be recorded. Someone recently said, well, why does it matter? Because dissent itself is a form of risk intelligence. In governance system, the absence of documented disagreements often create a false appearance of consensus. So certainly, I think due diligence is primal. When failure does occur, investigators, regulators, courts, and auditors frequently examine whether the warning signals existed before the event and whether the organization ignored them. This is part of the crisis management evaluation system processing. So dissenting analysis is preserving the record. So organization failure rarely occurs without warning, right? In many situations, someone identifies the risk, someone questions the assumptions, someone warned about the downstream consequences. The problem is often not the absence of awareness, it is the failure of escalation, documentation, action. These three things always is what basically takes an organization down to its knees. So remember, it's not that people are not aware of it. It's the fact that no one acts on it, right? No one escalates it. No one documents it. No one takes an action or pro-action into mitigating factors. So descending analysis, then what it does, it looks at unresolved objections, minority assessment, alternative interpretation, rejected recommendation. This then creates a traceability around the content and its decision. What it does furthermore, it prevents retrospective governance distortion. So after a failure, an organization sometimes unintentionally reconstructs history as though the risk was unforeseeable, or its consensus existed, or no meaningful objections were raised. Document dissent prevents institutional revisionism because it establishes the raised concerns. It talks about the mitigation factors, evidence supporting it, and the leadership chose not to opt out for it. So here's an example that I'm gonna let you know about. During a risk assessment of an AI content moderator system, a junior analyst, for example, raises a concern that a system training data is underrepresented. And I think certain languages and will likely perform poorly. So meaning that when you're using AI content to moderate even like a social media system, if you're deploying different languages, it is very imperative that you take the time in establishing the proper coding and architectural in order to use this AI. So the concern here was that it was acknowledged by the corporation, but it was not acted upon. So the system then was deployed without conducting a proper red assessment. 8 months later, this issue of the AI not recognizing the proper language and being able to proliferate the consistency of misclassifying it ended up causing a huge concern that was discovered and acted on, and it was recorded for reasoning. You can actually look it up just by me telling you. So what we found was that if it had been documented in the element 6 of the risk assessment, with the notion that it was acknowledged but not acted on at the record of the reasoning, the organization positions would be substantially different. So what we find is that a lot of times individuals do not take these concerns that are raised seriously, and they are working really hard, especially big organizations that have competitions, to to be part of the mix. They want to be part of this groundbreaking technology, AI systems, and okay, this is great, but remember, documentation, it demonstrates the process, which allows challenges, changes, risk assessments, and contrary evidence to also be considered. So if governance was not purely performative, what we see in high-risk AI systems is operate under uncertainty. So AI governance often involves incomplete information. Problematic issues may come up, and of course we've seen the bias security and deployment readiness. And in this case, if the AI was not able to recognize the language, the content that was posted essentially became very harmful to someone who was using the system, and unfortunately the outcome was not good. So the elements are important for you to understand that documentation not only holds people accountable, but it also negates huge organizational dilemmas or crisis down the line. Element 7 is about review date and owner. So when the assessment expires and who and by name is responsible for initiating that. You might think, well, why does it matter? Who cares? It matters. Remember what I said to you in module 1, and I said it here as well. AI is constantly growing, developing, learning, retesting, and you need to be up to date with your information, and not just you, the people that are responsible for specific sections of AI, because governance systems fail when responsibility becomes diffuse, reviews become optional, or risk assessments become statistics in artifacts disconnect from operational reality. So a review date and name owner creates continuity and accountability, and of course the life cycle control and transparency. So without those two elements of governance frequently degrades into documentation theater. What I find is assessments are usually not completed, but if you are, what you find is assessments are completed once, archived. Sometimes they're never revisited. We find a lot of times there's a disconnect from evolving system behavior. So the review structure exists for several reasons, and this is why we say review date and owner. The AI system changes over time. AI systems are not operationally static. Risk conditions evolve through model drift, changing data sets, new deployment contexts, sometimes there's software update, user adaptation, regulatory changes, emerging threat patterns. So the assessment is accurate when we say 6 months ago may no longer reflect what's happening. So the actual system behavior, the current legal obligations, the operational risk, downstream impact, these review dates establish reassessment as mandatory rather than discretionary. So the governance requires life cycle oversight, and modern AI governance frameworks emphasize the continuous monitoring rather than one-time approval or annual visit on expiration date. So this is why all of these contents are really important. Remember that you yourself have to always be accountable for your own actions. Depending on other people for what they think might be important is one thing, but I think at the end of the day, you need to always remember the action that one takes. I think my slide is frozen. So while I'm waiting for my slide to unfreeze, so here we pause and reflect on these questions. Again, the second question goes back to module 1, so if you haven't watched it, please go back and review it. To groupthink and authority bias, the system dynamics usually suppresses the dissent in decision-making meetings. And I think this has a lot to do with conformity with the chain of command and the style of management approach that your organization might take. But remember, staying silent usually in situations like this, especially if you're in a leadership role, means compliance, and that's the last thing that you want. Your first organizational AI task, here's one that it's a replica, not technical protocol. You can begin using this at any time. But one of the things I like you to focus on is everything we have covered today, the four-stage process, the biopsychosocial model, and the 5 failure categories that validate instruments, the 7-element documentation standard. It all leads here to a protocol you can start using this week, not someday, this week. It would be good. And 5 steps. The step 1 was select the AI system, not all of them, just one. Choose a system your organization currently uses. Try hiring a tool, schedule AI, a customer service bot, a predictive analytical platform, a recommendation engine. The protocol is the same regardless of the system. You're not trying to assess everything. You are learning the methodology on one system so you can replicate it on others. Step 2 is applying your biopsychosocial screen. And what is that? And we've already talked about it. So for each of these 3 dimensions, bio, psychological, and social, answer the 4 questions from lesson 2.2 documented earlier, and every answer with the date and the source of your information. Remember, you're practicing your forensic documentation standard, and ensure that, again, time, date, place, and if you have to initial, even if the person doesn't initial or the person doesn't identify, look at the time, timestamp everything. If you cannot answer a question, document that too, and record who would have access to the information and whether you can obtain it. Step 3 is about check for the 5 failure signals for each of the 5 failure categories from lesson 2.3. Mark it as present or absent or unknown. Unknown is not failure. It is an information gap. And information gaps are governance findings. Step 4 is produce a 7-element document. So using the forensic documentation standard from lesson 2.5, write up your findings. It does not need to be long, as 1-page document with all 7 elements present is more legally defensible than a 50-page report missing element 6. Completeness over length every time. And you might think, well, why do we need to? It's important, trust me. Step 5 is identify the gap. The distance between what you can currently document and what you should be able to document is your governance gap. Name it explicitly. Write it down, because the gap is where the module 3 begins. And this is the input to the LAPC model for an AI incident response, which we cover next. Okay, so I want to give you an example just so I can make sure that we are all on the same page. A compliance officer at a logistic company selects the company's AI power route optimization system. So this person, he or she, applies the BPS screen and discovers that she can answer all 4 B dimension questions from a vendor's documentation, 2 of 4 P dimension questions through the driver's interviews, and none of the 4 S dimension question, because no one has ever assessed community impact of routine decisions in a residential area. She checks the 5 failure signals and finds accountability vacuum and scope drifts both apply. So here, the system is now being used to generate driver performance scores, which was not in the original procurement scope. She produces a 4-page, 7-element document, flags a scope drift for immediate escalation, and schedules a follow-up review for 60 days later. This is a Practicum completed. This is governance in action. So what I like you to do is remember, this may be just a practice for you, but it becomes a habit. And moving forward, we already know that AI is being prominently used. We've seen AI even replacing certain positions, certain jobs. But again, someone needs to man the AI. Someone needs to be working the software. So that means that you yourself should be operating on an AI software that you have knowledge that you can protect yourself. Because at the end of the day, what is the point? What is the point of advancing yourself? And I think if you begin this week and come back and tell us what you found, I would be really happy. But also you'd be able to teach other people, including myself, about your findings and how you interpret the lesson that I am providing and that we're all learning together. Now, the two final questions I want you to take very seriously. One is complete the 5-step AI risk scan on systems in your organization this week. Then come back here and answer it. What did you find in step 3 and what could you not find and why? I generally want you to know what you find, not because I'm testing you, because your real world findings are exactly the kind of evidence that helps everyone in this community understand why AI governance actually looks like on the ground. So your experience is valuable. So therefore share it. Do you need to? No, but you don't need to identify what company you work for. You can call it company X. You don't have to provide specifics, but be mindful, because even if you don't provide specifics, if you do decide not to include the name but provide content that can identify the organization, it's very easy for people, the readers, to go in and check to see where it is, right? It's easy to obtain, so be mindful of that. Question 2 is, after completing this module, what is the single most important thing your organization needs to change about how it approaches AI risk assessment? Name the change, the reason, and who would need to support it. The 3 levels of specificity that we talked about, what, why, who, that is the level of precision that governance requires. That is a level of precision that moves things forward. So just remember that, and always be mindful about your own accountability. Now, I have provided you some scholarly journals that you can utilize and read about. Now, some are outdated, some are fundamentals, but I really like using them, and it's just there for you to use. Everything this course is evidence-based. A 4-stage risk assessment from 2025 study published through MIT at Risk Repository, which synthesizes 95 peer-reviewed studies covering 1,700 code AI risks. And all of these sources are listed on this slide, of course. They will also be in the video description and in the pinned comments below if you want to go deeper on this material, and I encourage you to do so. This is where to start. That is for module 2. 6 lessons, 1 complete methodology, 5-step practicums you can begin this week. You know the difference between risk awareness and structured risk assessment. You are a 3-dimensional framework. I am very proud of you. You have 4 validated instruments aligned with international regulatory standards. You have 7-element documentation standards that will hold up to external reviews, and you have a Practicum protocol that produces real governance output. Module 3 is called IAPP model applied to organizational AI risk. We take the risk if you have now learned to identify, and we build a crisis response and incident management framework around them. It is where the methodology becomes a system. Now, a quick word before you go. This course is free, and I believe in free education. I believe in knowledge should not be gated behind expensive certifications or corporational training budgets like I went through. This is why this is on YouTube, open to everyone. But you and I both know that nothing in life is truly free. Someone pays for the time, the research, the production, the consistency in this case, at someone that is me. And the way you support this work, it has been valuable to not only to me, but also to other people. Follow the channel, share the videos with one person in your field who needs this. Leave a comment, subscribe if you have not already. The channel is part of how I'm building something sustainable, a body free of educational work that I can continue to grow and that contributes to my long-term stability. Your follow, your share, your subscription, those are not small things. They are what makes continued free content possible. So if this module gave you something useful, share it. That is the exchange I'm asking for. Complete the practicum, come back and tell us all about it, and I will see you in module 3. Thank you so much, everyone.